Hello again. So we're going to continue our study of Sartre's book, Being in Nothingness. So far, we looked at the introduction, and we looked at the first chapter from part 1. We're now skipping entirely part 2, not because it's unimportant, it's actually quite an excellent section, but because we don't need it for the sake of just capturing our basic story of the sort of basic trajectory of the book. We're jumping to the first part of the next part of the book. And the specific thing that he wants to talk about here is our experience of other people and the distinctive and unique character of that experience. But before turning directly to the text, I want us just to think a little bit about the experience of other people. And so to do that, I want to begin by looking at this image by Edward Hopper from 1921 called Night Shadows. This guy walking down the street. This picture reminds me quite a bit of experiences I've had recently. I live in Toronto, and because of the pandemic, the city has largely been shut down, and so I have quite a unusual experience for living in this city, that I can go walking around at night and there's almost no one on the streets. So it's easy to go down major streets that otherwise would be, reasonably well populated, even late. It's easy to go down those streets now and have them pretty much deserted, and it's like you have the city kind of to yourself. And it offers an interesting perspective on the place that you don't usually get. And I'm hoping that you can identify with an experience that I have there. There's an interesting way that when you're out there, you kind of you do get to have the city to yourself in a way that you don't usually. And so it's interesting that as you experience it, or as I experience it at least, as I walk in these streets, they do actually kind of feel like my streets. Like for a little while, this is just my place. Maybe not unlike the way when I go home, the living room is my living room. It's my place, just for me. Because other people can't easily come in there, right? It's sort of defined by me. The city isn't usually defined that way, but there's a way in which, as I'm out there on my own walking at night, it's as if the place is just there for me. And so I'm hoping that you can sort of identify with that experience. Here's another one like this. This is also Edward Hopper from a few years later, 20 years later, 1942. This is a very famous image called Nighthawks. But if you were walking down the street and you came past this late at night, it's an interesting situation, right? So here you see people, but you're still walking down the street. Like, in fact, if you look back at that first picture, this is almost the perspective that guy could have. It's not quite the same store or bar, but pretty similar. Anyway, yeah. So as you, if you were walking down the street, you would be walking on a deserted street, but you would see this. And I want you just to try to think about what this is like. I think this picture, it's just sort of factual portrayal, but it captures something of what it's like to walk in those situations. Like you see those people, and you clearly know they're people, and you see life. But it's interesting that because it's in the restaurant and closed behind that glass, it does kind of seem like fish in an aquarium or something like that. Like it really does kind of feel that way as you walk past. Like there are people there, but the fact of that glass kind of separates those worlds. So you see that as a human world in there, and you know that you could go through the door and enter it, and it would be music playing or whatever, and it'd smell cigarette smoke, because in those days you could smoke in bars, and you'd hear people talking, and maybe you would talk to someone, and like if you've ever done that, gone from that kind of deserted street into a place, then that sort of distinctive feeling of like this quite a shift in reality. And similarly, if you're in a bar like that, even if you're not hanging around with anybody, but you're just in the presence of people and all that sort of stuff, and then you walk out, again, there's a pretty big shift when you close the door behind you, and you have this feeling like, oh, I left that world of liveliness and so on for this sort of very deserted world. You might like that, or you might not like it, but I'm hoping that you you recognize that experience. Anyway, so as you're walking past here, I want to say, look, you see people there, and you don't mistake them for dogs or mannequins. You know that they're like that one couple presumably is out on a date of some sort, and you imagine them talking to the guy who's working behind the bar, and you can sort of imagine the things that are happening there. You know that there are people with having the kinds of experiences people have, but there is an interesting way it doesn't touch you. That you sort of keep them at a distance, sort of as objects, right? Well, let's go back to that first picture. If you were walking on this deserted street, you could imagine all of a sudden that as you come up to a corner like this, somebody else comes around the corner. And I'd like you to think about what that is like. What that's like when suddenly someone comes out of an otherwise deserted street and you see them. When as soon as another person enters, it kind of shatters the experience. And it doesn't just shatter it in the sense that I theoretically think, oh, maybe that person's going to do something to disturb me or anything like that. It's more like it's not just mine anymore. It's not just my private little thing. That person's coming suddenly sort of thematizes, makes thematic, makes explicit the kind of public and shared character of this space. And it's like, it's not mine. It's something for that other person. And that's more or less the situation Sartre describes in that, what I think is that great and very vivid description of sitting in a public park. Pages 341 to, I guess about 344, something like that. So he says, what's happening there is he says you're sitting in a park, and it's the same as what I'm saying about walking down the street. You're sitting in a park, and the breeze is blowing, the little birds chirping. It's just your place, and somebody else comes. And he says, what happens when another person comes is it's as if, I said before when I was walking down the street, it was as if the place was for me. Well, as soon as somebody else enters, it's as if the place is for her, for them, for him. So it's as if the grass or the breeze that was sort of, speaking to you or speaking for you suddenly turns a face towards that other person. And with that city street, it was becoming kind of my private dream world, almost sort of daydream world, my imaginary world. And then suddenly it's not that. Suddenly it's meaning something to that other person, and it's that other person's presence kind of makes it clear, not in a theoretical way. I mean, that could be true too, but that's not the primary thing. The other person's makes it clear in a kind of immediate, almost visceral way that the space is for them, not just for me. And so it's as if the world that was all sort of pointing to me suddenly turns away. And so he says he describes the other person as, it's almost like you sort of pull the plug on the bath. He says the other person's kind of like a drain hole. Like you had this nice little world that was this cozy world surrounding you, and it's suddenly pouring out the drain, and it's that other person, that's the drain. I think that's a really great description. I encourage you to read it carefully. It's the experience of what it is for another person to come into the scene, and the point that he's really trying to make is another person entering the scene is not like a parking meter. You're around a corner and there's a parking meter there. So that's a new thing that entered your visual field or whatever. But the world doesn't turn its face towards that parking meter the way it turns its face towards that other person. Why? Because that other person, like you, is a subject of experiences. That other person is a being for itself. And that's to recognize another person as a person is to recognize that as someone for whom experience is happening, right? And so what happens in that situation where someone else comes into the deserted street or someone else comes into the public park is that park, in recognizing what has come into that space as a person, you are recognizing that what has come into that space is someone for whom this park or this deserted street is an object, right? And so the recognition of the presence of a person comes through and as the experience of this world as being for them, right? And so you have an immediate sense that another person is present in having the immediate sense that this world is showing its face to them, to that person. So the experience of the person is the bubble of your experience of the world has been popped, and or the air or the water, the bathtub, whatever it is sort of draining away towards the other person. So there, the thing I want you to think about there, and the thing that's really the point of this is the whole meaning of another person is that is a being for itself, the same kind of thing you are. And what he's trying to get at in this chapter is, what is it to experience another one like yourself, right? Something else that is a being for itself. And you're only going to do that if you experience that thing as a kind of subject, someone for whom experience is happening. But what is that? What would that definitively mean? Well, to experience the other person as a being for itself is to experience the other person as that different perspective, right? You're basically a perspective. That other person is a perspective too. But precisely because it's a different perspective, you can't inhabit it. So the remarkable thing, and the thing that's going to really be striking to our analysis, the remarkable thing about the experience of another person is that it's the experience of something you can't experience. It's the experience of something that is inherently closed to you. So you find yourself, so to speak, in the presence of another person. But what is present to you is precisely something that can't be present to you, something that can't be presented to you, something that is definitively alien to the possibilities of your own experience. So you're encountering the kind of presence of an absence. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But so the issue then, or the thing we're talking about then, is how do you experience the presence of something you can't actually experience? And by saying how do you, we're not asking a kind of causal question, in the sense of, what makes it possible that this happens. It does happen. We're talking about an experience we have. So we're not asking what makes it happen or what makes it possible. We're asking what form does it take. Right? So how do we experience the presence of another person? Well, we experience the presence of another person in as much as we experience our world as not for us but for someone else. So you experience the presence of another person to the extent that you experience the world as sort of pointing its meaning away from you, but in a way you can't really make sense of, a way that's precisely not shown to you. You experience the world as showing itself to someone else, and in that sense not showing itself to you. So now let me go back to that point about absence, and then I want to just say these two things that I've said kind of side by side. So, we saw already in the story of looking for Pierre in the cafe from back around page 40 or 41, we saw Sartre's analysis of the phenomenological analysis of the experience of Pierre's absence, right? And the point was, if you describe the form your experience actually takes, you have an intuition of something not being there. It's not the same as the intuition of, that's not the same as not having the experience of something being there. It's the positive experience of something not being there, the experience of an absence. And that's what happens every time you encounter another person. You have that sort of immediate kind of intuition of an absence. But it's a different kind of absence, right? It's not the absence of someone who is supposed to be spatially present and is not spatially there. This is an experience of a different kind of absence. This is the experience of basically, exactly what it is. This is the experience of another subjectivity, which precisely insofar as it is a subjectivity is definitively not for you. It's something for itself, not for you. Right? So you experience it as an absence. You experience the presence of an absence, and you experience that presence of an absence in and as the experience of the world turning its face in a different direction. So there, I'm trying to sort of build up a couple of layers to what it's like to experience other people. So first, we were just walking down the street, and then in that first Edward Hopper etching, and then we were looking into that bar in that other Edward Hopper, the Nighthawks painting, and there we saw people there, but they didn't really impinge on us. Like that was almost, it's a very real experience, but it's almost like it's a very detached experience. It's almost theoretical, but it's not. It's just that they don't really impinge on your world, and you can sort of stay in your private reverie. But now I'm getting you to imagine this other experience where someone comes into your room, into your world, and that's like Sartre's description of the public park. And there, it grips you in a way that those people in the Nighthawk diner didn't, right? Because it's your world now that suddenly turns its face elsewhere, right? So, when you recognize those people in the bar as other people, you were recognizing them as subjects. You knew that there was a romance or a fight between that couple, or there was a conversation with the server or whatever. But the experience of the subjectivity of the person is more pronounced in this new story I'm talking about, when someone comes in and you sort of feel your world kind of taken away from you. But even there, you're definitely coming up against the subjectivity of another person and recognizing it, and that's what we're describing. What is it to recognize a subject? But interestingly here, the subjectivity of the other person is still kind of experienced by you as an object, right? In that it's a thing that's happening in front of you, and you see that you sort of experience the world as being taken away into the bubble of that other person's experience. But that's something of which you are having a kind of experience, right? It's like an object for you. But now, to put the last level on our story, let's say that person comes up to you and says, "Give me your money," or something like that, whatever people say. But somebody comes up to you or does something. I want to try to capture the discomfort. Somebody does something that you experience as kind of threatening. Maybe not as much as saying, "Give me your money." Maybe you just think they're going to do that. Maybe the person is walking along with his or their head down, and suddenly they turn up and they look at you with a kind of menacing look. And think about how your experience would change in that moment. Right? In that moment, the thing that happens is you suddenly experience yourself as, quite pointedly, looked at. And this section of Sartre's chapter is called the look, the gaze, right? And that's what I'm trying to get at here. Suddenly you are looked at. And the thing that Sartre really wants to describe in this chapter is what that is like to be looked at, and what that means, and what experientially that is like. And that's what I want you just to think about here. It seems to me, just as you would have a kind of visceral experience of a change in your situation when that person first entered your private world, where you're having your little reverie in the deserted street or the park. Similarly, you'd have a visceral change of experience again when that person suddenly looked at you in this sort of menacing way. And Sartre says the thing that's happened there is now you're experiencing that other subject as a subject and not as an object. How does that happen? It happens because you can't get inside their experience and live out their subjectivity from their perspective, right? Okay. It happens here because you experience yourself as an object for them. Right? In this situation, in experiencing yourself as the object for another gaze, a change in the way you experience yourself, you experience the presence of another subject. And that's the thing then that he really wants to talk about. He wants to talk about that way that we have an experience of other persons who are subjects. We have an experience of their subjectivity. And we have that experience but again, it's an absence, right? We don't have that experience by suddenly somehow inhabiting their perspective from the subject position. We don't, in that sense, know what it's like to be them. It's not that. We have an experience of their subjectivity insofar as we experience ourselves as objects for them, as having become an object. So I want to get to that point because I want to read a quotation from Being in Nothingness that I think is the core of the whole thing. I mean, this whole section is really rich and great, but I think this is the one sort of sentence without which you wouldn't be getting it. This is on page 345. He says, thus, this relation, which I call being seen by another, far from being merely one of the relations signified by the word man, represents an irreducible fact which cannot be deduced either from the essence of the other as object or from my being as subject. And then about 6 or 7 lines further down from there, he says, being seen by the other is the truth of seeing the other. So I just want to talk about those 2 sentences for a second, but that's the thing you need to understand. It's not actually that hard, but that's what you got to understand. If you get that, then you get the whole thing. So the first point is, so the first thing he says is that, this experience of being seen by another person, like, if you just had some whatever everyday sense of the other person, you say, yeah, there's another person, and one of the things that person might do is turn and look at me. Oh, I could be seen by the other person, and that other person could also grab things. Another person could also have its lunch, and so on. Right? You would, in your everyday way of thinking, you would think of another just as one of the things in the real world, like you imagine yourself to be, and you would think, oh, one of the things that person could do is see me. Sartre is challenging that and saying that actually has the cause and effect in a way kind of reversed. So in our everyday way of thinking of it, we just take it for granted that we see other people. We don't really know how. We just take it that they're given. And then we see being seen by them as one of their possibilities, as a consequence of the fact that there are others. And he's saying it's quite the opposite. He's saying the irreducible fact from which everything comes is that we have an experience of being seen. And it is that experience that is what it means to say there is another person, right? To say there is another person is to say there is a thing that can see me. Right? The very meaning of other person is that one for whom I can be an object. And so the sense we live with that there are other people in the world is an effect of the fact that we have the experience of being seen, not the other way around. So that's what that first sentence said, right? When he said, far from being merely one of the relations signified by the word man, represents an irreducible fact, ... And then he says a little bit further, he says, it cannot be deduced either from the essence of the other as object or from my being as a subject. So the thing he wants to say there is, the very notion of being a subject is irreducibly different from the notion of being an object. If you have the experience of some objects in the world, just some things outside you, there's nothing from what is given as an object that can give you further that thing as a subject, right? Remember, the point was that subjectivity is a kind of absence. So it's actually it's crazy that you can experience other subjects. You do, right? You do have these experiences of absence, whether we're talking about subjectivity or Pierre's absence from the cafe, right? So we got to remember to stay true to our phenomenological project of describing the form in which our experience actually happens, not entertaining our own causal theories about where experience might come from. We're describing, the form meaning takes in our lived experience. And we do have the experience of other people. We do have the experience of other subjects, and that's the experience of a kind of absence. It's precisely the experience of, think of what it's like when you experience someone, you don't know what they're thinking, right? It's precisely the experience of something, the sense of which you cannot get from what is actually presented to you. So, if I come upon another person, I can perfectly map everything about their physical features, their position, their time, their shape, how they moved, and so on. And that will never tell me what they're thinking. Again, go back to the Pierre in the cafe. He said, everybody's seeing the same cafe, but you don't know what a person is thinking about or putting their attention on. So you don't know what the figure is in that person's experience. Right? You don't know what their experience is about. And that's to say you don't know what is happening for them. Because the same setting can be differentiated into figure and background in infinitely different ways. And you have no idea what that other person is doing. And unless they tell you. And even if they tell you, they could be lying. And that's part of why, throughout this section, he keeps using the language of probability. And he's saying that's the thing about experiencing other people is that you're never in the position of having on your own terms direct experiential certainty of what their experience is. They can tell you, and you might have good reason for believing it, but their experience never gets beyond, sort of epistemically speaking, what their experience is never for you gets beyond the condition of probability. You can never know what's actually going on in there directly. But so the point I'm trying to make there is, no matter, the most exhaustive account of the objective features is insufficient to give you what that subjectivity is. And for that reason, the subjectivity of another could never be derived from, just a derivative of, the experience of the other as object. It's a qualitatively different kind of experience and irreducibly different. But also, the experience of another as a subject can't come from your experiences of yourself as a subject. True enough, you're in recognizing another subject, you're recognizing something that's like yourself. So your sense of what it is to be a self is coming from your own experience and so on. But the experience is precisely of something that exceeds your subjectivity and has access to you in a way that is impossible for you. Right? It is precisely other. It's something that by definition has to exceed the terms of your subjectivity, the terms of your for itself. So the experience of another has to be an irreducibly unique fact and type of meaning that is not just a byproduct of the experience of yourself and not just a byproduct of the experience of the other as an object. Right? So that's why he says, this relation, which I call being seen by another, is not just one of the relations signified by the word man, and it represents an irreducible fact which cannot be deduced either from the essence of the other as object or from my being as a subject. And then, as he said, so what we're naming there in being seen by another is this unique thing that is essentially what defines what it is for something to be another person. And so that's why he says in that later line, being seen by the other is thus the truth of seeing the other. What does that mean? Well, you see something as another person to the extent that you see something that sees you. Right? That's the interesting and quite fertile. From the point of view of going on to understand things, this is a very fertile point. That's the very fertile sort of paradox that you see the other when you experience yourself as being seen. That's the striking thing. So as I said, that's the point. That's the first and the main point I wanted to get to. Now I want to go on and say a little bit more about that experience of seeing the other, and I was talking about what happens when you're walking down the street and suddenly that person looks up at you, and that's when you suddenly feel turned into an object, right? And I mean, that's such a rich topic, the experience of finding yourself an object, that I could talk about it for hours and hours, and I actually want to keep it to a minimum and leave it as a rich thing for you to explore. I'm sure it will come back. So I just want to name it. But I'll just say that, remember, that experience of being objectified is so powerful. It's if you think of Frantz Fanon's discussion of the lived experience of the black man, the experience of racism, in the essay "The Lived Experience of the Black Man," in his book "Black Skin, White Masks," right? That's all about what happens when you find yourself an object for another's gaze. It's at the heart of so much feminism, the experience of women as objectified by the male gaze and so on. Could go on and on about this. I mean, there's so much embedded in this point that's coming out here. I just want to name those two things to sort of help you think of these very powerful discourses that you could connect to the point that's being made here if we were going to further explore it phenomenologically. For the moment, we're not going to, because I just want to move on to a different thing that he wants to bring out that I think is quite rich and worthy of our consideration. Anyway, so when another person looks at you, that's when you find yourself essentially turned into an object, and in that sense, that's the way you experience the subjectivity of the other. So I want you to think about that experience of being looked at, and as again, the title of this section is the look. The other person turns their eyes on you. So I want you to think about the eyes. And Sartre says quite an interesting thing here, right? He says, do you remember I was just saying that I was quoting that sentence, right? That being seen by the other is the truth of seeing the other, so that, you see that thing to the extent that you experience yourself as being seen. Well, I want you to think about that now, specifically with respect to the eyes. And Sartre says this interesting thing that what it takes to experience yourself as looked at by another's eyes is that in a significant way you can't look at the eyes, right? The eyes become a kind of stand-in for subjectivity. And to the extent that you can have them as your object and look at them, you're not feeling yourself looked at. You're not feeling yourself turned into an object. But something really changes when you experience yourself as looked at. And you might experience this in conversational situations. It's very common when people are talking that the one speaking will not very much look into the eyes of the one listening. The one speaking generally kind of looks around like this, and the one listening is sort of looking at the face of the one speaking. And if it's very weird if you are listening and the person keeps looking at you while you're talking. It's almost impossible to listen to them speak because it's typically very uncomfortable. And similarly for the one speaking, it's typically quite kind of off-putting when they're looking around to look too long at the one they're speaking to. What happens in those contexts, in those conversations, is that when you have that experience of the speaker trying to look at the listener and at the same time the listener trying to look at the speaker, a kind of uncomfortable situation typically results of people not being able to sit comfortably in the role they've adopted. And it's because I think it's because when you're speaking, if you suddenly look at that person, you see them looking at you, you suddenly find yourself as an object, and it changes the way you have been inhabiting your own ideas and your own space, not unlike when that guy comes walking down the street and looks up at you and so on. And similarly, when you're listening, you're engaged in this person's world and so on. If that person starts staring at you, it once again suddenly kind of strips you of your ability to inhabit that kind of relationship to the situation that you were involved in. You might note that in your conversations and see the sort of thing I'm talking about. Again, you might think of this in romantic or sexual situations. If you're touching another person or, and in some important way looking at them, it's very different if that person now looks you in the eye. It might be a nice thing, but it changes the terms in which you're interacting with that person, and you can't easily relate to that person as a body. I'm not saying you were just turning them into a mere body. I don't mean that. You may very well be powerfully interacting with that person and as a subject and so on, but you're relating to them, that person as a body, and how they are a body changes pretty powerfully if that person looks you in the eye, right? So you might think of these as the conversation or the sexual situation. You might think of those things which are very powerful domains of interpersonal dynamism and so on. Think about the charged character of the look and what happens with it. And remember, the thing I was trying to explain in Sartre is just this idea that you can't look at eyes that are looking at you, right? You either are looking at them or you're being looked at by them. But the experience of being looked at is you experience yourself as an object for the other. And that it really takes away the possibility of the experience being defined as you as a subject looking at them. The eyes that look at you are subjects, not objects, right? And that's the condition of experiencing yourself as being looked at. And so I want to look at this self-portrait by Henri Fantin-Latour. This one is from 1854. This guy drew a lot of self-portraits, and when we go on to look at Derrida's book Memoirs of the Blind, he talks about these a lot. But I wanted you to look at this first because I think it's a funny thing to look at those eyes. Like if you don't, right now you're probably staring at the picture because I have it on the screen. It would be nice if you could go back to the second when I first put the picture up, or if you could look away and kind of look back at it. Like it's an interesting thing that it's a picture where I think you can kind of experience yourself, for a moment as being looked at by someone's face. But an interesting change happens that you start looking at it and you do turn those eyes kind of into objects, the things that you look at. And I think it's quite interesting if you just fiddle around with your experience of seeing this picture, that you can sometimes feel looked at by it, but more commonly you don't, precisely because you make it something that you can look at. So I'd like you to try to play around with that and see if you can see my point. And as I said, we'll come back to that when we get to Derrida, but maybe you could just think about that, or work at it. Anyway, but let's go back to this issue of eyes. So I was talking about the sense that there's this thing in the world, these eyes, these optical globes that look out at you. They are the things in the world through which you experience a look. But then Sartre says, it doesn't have to be through the eyes. So he says, if you're, a lot of his images are taken from warfare. He wrote this, right around that time of the Second World War, and that was on his mind. And he has a lot of great examples from that. Like last time we talked a little bit about the anguish of the guy wondering about what's going to happen when he faces the artillery bombardment and so on. Here he says, imagine people who are soldiers who are behind enemy lines or whatever, fighting the enemy, and they're sort of crouched on the ground. They're advancing, they're crawling forward, but they're being very careful because they believe there's someone up in that house who's got a machine gun who's going to shoot them or something like that. And he says, experientially, what that's like. They don't see any human organism around. You just see a scene with trees and grass and a farmhouse or whatever. But they experience that farmhouse as something that can see them. They experience it as looking at them. Basically identically to the way you can experience eyes as looking at you. And I want you I think that's a pretty important point. I wanted you to think about it here because I wanted you to think about that way that the experience of being looked at is really something that is kind of defining the meaning of the whole of a situation. And it's not just some, isolated interaction between me and this other body, even though in a way it's tied to the eyes, or in this case the farmhouse. But it's the way the whole sense of my existence in relationship to this whole situation is defined. And really the farmhouse or the eyes becomes the kind of lens or portal through which the experience of being looked at kind of happens. I want to look at another picture just because I think it kind of might help with that a little bit. This is Andrew Wyatts painting Christina's World from 1948. And this one, I don't know what this one is about. There's, a woman sort of lying on the ground, which is not a usual position for a person to be in. The grass or the wheat, whatever it is kind of wild where she is, although as you go a little closer you see that it's nicely cut. And then there's that farmhouse over there. You don't see her face, and you think, wow, why would someone be in that position? There are some biographical details about this picture that have led lots of people to conclude that they know what this picture is about, including some things that Andrew Wyeth himself said. I don't tend to take those things very seriously when I'm trying to understand artworks. I think you just have the image to go with, and you want to think about what's going on there. And I think most people, when they see this image, find something a little disquieting about it. Why is that woman there? And she's looking over at the farmhouse, but that kind of looking over, like, in what sense is she looking over? And I guess when I have looked at this picture, I have often thought of something like Sartre says about the soldiers, right? That's like, maybe there's the sense that there's something a little scary over there and that she's being looked at by it. I don't know if that's so. And as I said, if you looked at what Andrew Wyeth says about it, it might seem the opposite, because he says this is a picture, sort of about the hope about this as a person who can't walk, who's, able to negotiate around the farm, and that's where she lives and so on. Yeah, maybe that's right. But the image by itself, I don't know that that's what it says. But in any case, I'd like you to think about that and just think about this in relationship to the sort of thing Sartre was saying. And that question of where, like, let's say you can see something kind of ominous or disquieting about that. Where does it come from? That, there's, you might think, oh, there's somebody, maybe you would think there's someone who maybe is going to do something bad to this woman, or who has done something bad to this woman. And I think that's an experience lots of people have when they look at this. That's what's sort of frightening to them. So the thing that's frightening is the presence of that someone else who might, see her and find her and do something. But the thing that's then so striking is that you can experience a someone else here, even though there is no organism of a human being, of another human being, visually present to you. Right? You can have the sense of someone else's perspective defining this scene, even though there is no human body around there. So I think of this picture in that way as kind of helpful for thinking about just what that sense of the gaze is. And I guess I want to bring that back to that quotation from, let me go back to the book, that quotation I read before, where he said, "This relation that I call being seen by another, far from being merely one of the relations signified by the word man, ... Right? I want to go back to that idea that the thing we're talking about is the unique experience we have of existing in a world where we are seen. And that's basically the thing that I want you to think about. So those are some remarks about the issue of eyes. I just want to read a couple of the passages where he says those kinds of things I was saying. So on 346, he says, the other's look hides his eyes. So that was the point I was making about, in a way, not being able to look at eyes that are looking at you. And then on 347 is where he's talking about the way the look is manifest through things other than just the eyes. And so he says, what I apprehend immediately, there's about 20 some lines down in 347. What I apprehend immediately when I hear the branches crackling behind me is not that there is someone there. It is that I am vulnerable, that I have a body which can be hurt. In short, that I am seen. Right? So that stuff on 346 to 347, it seems to me, brings out the ways in which the look comes at us from something other than just the material presence of the other's organism. And so I just want to make one last point now. It's just the next thing he talks about. I want to talk about this experience of oneself as an object, which is to say the experience of the other as a subject. Just how that comes up, how that's lived. And he gives this example here of, looking through the keyhole. He says, you might, maybe you're spying on someone to see what they're doing. Or maybe you're looking at somebody's email account. Maybe they left their computer open and you think, oh, I wonder who they write email messages to. And you're looking at that or something like that. So he says, in that case, when you're doing it, he says, I'm going to read a chunk now from, I guess, the bottom of 347 and the top 348. So he says, in those, if I'm doing that, if I'm looking at somebody else's Facebook messages, or if I'm looking through the keyhole or whatever it is, he says, this is near the bottom of 347. In that context, I am a pure consciousness of things, and those things caught up in the circuit of my selfness offer to me their potentialities as the proof of my non-thetic consciousness of my own possibilities. I mean, the things he's saying there repeat the logical sort of structures we already read about back in those opening sections. We read them actually. It was our first discussion. It was actually around page 74 or so, when he's talking about the experience of person in action as unreflective consciousness of situation of exigency and so on. And, so he's repeating the language he uses there, and he says that even more clearly. He says, this means that behind that door, a spectacle is presented as to be seen. The way a doorknob says to be opened, or the way things present themselves, or the alarm clock says to be shut off and for you to get up to work and so on. Things present themselves as sort of summonses, right? So that spectacle presents itself as to be seen, or a conversation as to be heard. The door, the keyhole, they are at once both instruments and obstacles. They are presented as to be handled with care, etc., etc. He describes that. And so he says, I do what I have to do. And he says, in that context, he's saying you're just wrapped up in it, right? He says, no transcending view comes to confer upon my acts the character of a given on which a judgment can be brought to bear. On the consciousness, here's the thing. My consciousness sticks to my acts. My consciousness is my acts. And my acts are commanded only by the ends to be attained and by the instruments to be employed. I mean, that sentence there, my consciousness sticks to my acts, it is my acts, and my acts are commanded only by the ends to be attained and by the instruments to be employed. That's just the mirror image of that line that the everyday consciousness of the person is the unreflective consciousness of someone in action who's aware of a situation of exigency. If you go back to that thing, it's what, 74, 76, something like that. If you go back to that sentence and read it beside this, you'll see a perfect parallel, right? So that's what it's like. But what happens is someone that comes to see you at the door, and suddenly you're aware of yourself, right? Suddenly I hear footsteps, and I think, oh no, I'm going to be seen. So there you're pulled out of your absorption in the situation, and you're made aware of yourself. But the interesting thing there is, he says, first of all, this is 349, about 10 or 12 lines down. First of all, I now exist as myself for my unreflective consciousness. Right? In other words, here, it's not that you're sitting back on your own choosing just to think about yourself. Here, the immediate situation has brought to life for you the sense of yourself as someone who's doing something, and that has happened because you've experienced yourself as now an object for someone else. So he says in that situation, he says, this is now right around the middle of the page, he says, now the unreflective consciousness is a consciousness of the world. That's again just that quotation about exigency. He says, therefore, for the unreflective consciousness, the self now exists on the level of objects in the world. Right, this consciousness, this experience of someone else looking at you that you got by hearing their footsteps on the stairs, immediately made you experience yourself as a thing in the world. Not at the level of reflecting on yourself like the reflective cogito, in the sense, on the contrary, of being still a practical consciousness oriented towards action, and you have suddenly arisen for yourself as a thing in the world. So he says, this role, which otherwise devolved only on the reflective consciousness, which was the making presence of the self, belongs now to the unreflective consciousness. Right? So he's trying to describe here in that situation of what happens when you look through the keyhole or something. He's just trying to describe that experience of finding yourself as an object and trying to show that it's experientially immediate and that it's a matter of that kind of unreflective practical consciousness, not a matter of stepping back and explicitly reflecting on yourself aesthetically. And that's the difference basically between, I guess, experiencing yourself as a subject and experiencing yourself as an object here explicitly. And anyway, so he talks about that, like that you have this lived sense of yourself that's kind of an immediate experience of yourself as something in the world for someone else. And that's what he says is really fundamentally, that's at the core of experience of shame, where shame doesn't just mean the bad sense of shame. It means that too, but it means the broader sense of that that feeling of the estimation, the esteeming of your worth in the eyes of others. So if you use shame to name that whole domain, then shame in the more normal sense of the negative and pride in the sense of the positive are both versions of that sort of sense of shame, you might say. Anyway, that he's saying is the most basic meaning of what another person is. So what it is to see another is to experience yourself as seen. And the most basic meaning of that is to have a sense of shame, to live in that sense of your worth being estimated, being the subject to you being subject to someone else's esteem, not at the level of a thing you think about, at the level of how you experience who you are. As he says in here somewhere, actually that same page 350, probably about 18 lines down, 20 lines down. Here he says, your relationship to yourself is not one of knowing, but of being, right? You have a sense of what you are. It's not a matter of a cognitive relationship to yourself. It's how you live your own who, right? And this is talking about the shame and pride business. And so that's why he says then on 351, about a dozen lines down, the other's freedom is revealed to me across the uneasy indetermination of the being which I am for him. Right? So to experience another person is to experience you, what you actually are, as in a way defined by or subject to definition by someone else's perspective. So the experience of another person is actually you discovering another dimension about yourself. It's discovering about yourself a reality to what you are that is not something you make up on your own. You don't get to say what it is. They get to say what it is. But it's not just the other person's opinion. It's how you experience your own what. So the other person, in a way, gets to tell you something about who you are that in a sense you can never see, but it is also who you are, so you can't disavow it. So that's where I want to get to. That's the last point I want to make. So what I wanted to do here was just take you through a set of those issues, to talk first about just the basic experience of the other person, to go through a few versions of that, to get us to the point where we could make sense of this idea that to experience another person really is to experience yourself as seen, which is to experience yourself as an object. And then I want to give you this point about the look from the other. It doesn't just come from eyes exactly. It's a thing that defines the meaning of everything in the situation, everything in that world. And that to have that experience is not to have a conceptual, it's not to have a theory about something. It's not an idea that you have. It's a lived sense of what you are. And in that sense, the experience of the other person is a revelation to you of the whatness of you, the essence of you, the very thing you are that you're kind of stuck with, that you can't disavow, but you also can't exactly own. Like, you can't ever see it and make it something that you run. So the experience of the other, in other words, reveals to you a side of yourself that you have to live, that is always in a certain sense mysterious to you. So I'm going to leave it there for now. I mean, I think if you get those points, you can read much more of the chapter effectively. There's a lot more in that chapter, and even in the pages that I skipped through. But I think that should give you enough. That's the basic point. That should give you enough to read through it. And we're going to go from there now to talk about the nature of the body.